There are boxes of documents in the National Archives of the United States that did not become widely accessible to historians until the 1960s. Inside those boxes are reports filed by Japanese naval pilots during the last 2 years of the Pacific War, translated into English by American naval intelligence officers in the months immediately following Japan's surrender in 1945. The reports come from different squadrons, different carriers, different battles spread across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. The men who wrote them never met each other. When historians finally began sitting down with the full archive, what they expected to find was a range of opinions, a range of observations, a range of voices. What they found instead was a chorus. The Japanese pilots, in language so consistent across so many independent sources that scholars at first questioned whether the translations themselves were accurate, were all saying the same thing. About the same aircraft, in nearly the same words. This is the story of what they said, why they said it, and how a quiet engineer working at a factory on Long Island, 5 months before Pearl Harbor had even been attacked, built the airplane that put those words into their mouths. Before we begin, you should understand one thing. The men we are about to talk about on both sides were not myths. They had wives, they had mothers. They had names you are going to hear in the next hour. Some of them came home, most of them did not. December 8th, 1941. 500 miles north of Manila, the engines of 45 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros are warming in the pre-dawn darkness of an airfield in Tainan, Taiwan. It is 2 in the morning. One of the pilots is 25 years old. His name is Saburo Sakai. He is the son of a peasant farmer from Saga Prefecture who died when Sakai was 11. He was a violent child. He fought, he stole. He was sent to live with an uncle in Tokyo who taught him obedience with a bamboo cane. At 16, he enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Navy. At 21, he was selected for flight school. Of the 70 candidates in his graduating class, 65 were eliminated before graduation. Sakai graduated first. He had been told that no navy in the world ran a training program as severe as the one he had just survived. He had been told that he was now among the finest fighter pilots alive. He had been told that the aircraft he flew was the most advanced carrier-based fighter ever produced. All 3 things were true. In 90 minutes his engine will lift him into the darkness above the South China Sea. He will fly 1,200 miles round trip to attack American airfields outside Manila. It will be the longest fighter mission attempted by any air force in the history of warfare to that date. He will return that evening having shot down his first American aircraft. He will return having watched the United States Far East Air Force lose half of its bombers and a third of its fighters on the ground. He will return believing, with the certainty of a man who has seen evidence with his own eyes, that the war his country has begun is a war his country will win. He will be wrong, but not for the reason he expects. To understand what was about to happen in the Pacific Ocean, you have to go back 4 years. Tokyo. October 1937. A 34-year-old aeronautical engineer named Jiro Horikoshi receives a document from the Imperial Japanese Navy. He sits in the design office of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. The room smells of cigarette smoke and graphite and machine oil. The document is stamped with the seal of Naval Air Headquarters. It is the specification for a new aircraft. The 12th She carrier fighter. Horikoshi reads it 3 times. The document tells him what the aircraft must do. It must climb to 10,000 feet in 3.5 minutes. It must reach 270 knots. It must fly for 6 hours with drop tanks. It must carry 2 20mm cannons and 2 7.7mm machine guns. It must operate from the smallest decks in the Imperial fleet. It must turn tighter than anything in the British or American inventories. His senior engineers, when they read the same document the next morning, tell him it is impossible. Horikoshi tells them to find a way. What the specification does not contain, anywhere in its precise Imperial naval engineering language, is any mention of the survival of the man who will fly the aircraft. There is no requirement for armor behind the pilot's head. There is no requirement for self-sealing fuel tanks. There is no requirement for crash protection. No specification for cockpit padding. No demand for an engine that can continue to function after taking a single rifle round to a critical line. There is no mention of the human body that will sit at the center of the machine. Hiroyoshi understood the omission. He wrote about it in his memoirs 4 decades later, after Hiroshima, after Nagasaki, after the rebuilding of Japan. The Navy, he wrote, was telling him what it wanted. It was also telling him what it did not consider important. He set the document down. He looked out at the grey Tokyo afternoon and he began to work. This is the first thing you have to understand about the Zero. It was not designed with a pilot in mind, it was designed with a mission in mind. The pilot was a control system that happened to be made of meat. This is not editorializing. It is the design philosophy as the Imperial Japanese Navy wrote it down. The Navy in 1937 believed in a particular theory of war. The theory held that aircraft were tools. Aircrew were operators of tools. A skilled operator could be replaced with another skilled operator if the training pipeline produced enough of them. What could not be replaced was time. Time over the ocean. Time over the target. Time in the turn. The Navy wanted those minutes and those miles, and it wanted them at any cost. Hiroyoshi gave them what they asked for. The aircraft he produced weighed less than any comparable fighter in the world. Its airframe was constructed from a new aluminum alloy called extra super duralumin, lighter than anything the Americans or the British were using. Its wings were riveted with countersunk fasteners that saved fractions of a kilogram. Its skin was so thin in places that ground crews could deform it by leaning on it the wrong way. It was a miracle of weight reduction. It had no armor. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. When a Zero took a hit to the wing tanks, the high-octane aviation fuel inside vaporized into the wing void. When that vapor touched a spark, the wing exploded. The pilot, who sat inches from the fuel tanks with no armor between his body and the gasoline, did not survive what came next. The first Zero pilots noticed this immediately. They flew combat over China beginning in 1940. By the spring of 1941, reports were being filed inside the Imperial Naval Air Service. Reports noting that Zeros were burning when they should not have been burning. Reports noting that pilots were dying from wounds that other air forces routinely survived. Reports noting that the absence of even minimal armor was producing casualty rates that could not be sustained in a longer war. The Imperial Japanese Navy received those reports. It refused to act on them. The decision to leave the Zero unarmored was reaffirmed at the highest levels of Naval Air Headquarters. The reasoning was contained in a single phrase that appears in various forms throughout the internal correspondence of the period. The pilots could be replaced. The range could not. Hiroyoshi was told to leave the aircraft as it was. He did. By December 7, 1941, more than 300 Zeros had been built. 79 of them were on the carrier decks of the Kido Butai, the Imperial First Air Fleet, 230 miles north of Oahu, preparing to attack Pearl Harbor. What happened next has filled libraries. The Zeros that strafed Hickam Field and Wheeler Field encountered almost no air opposition. The handful of American fighters that managed to get airborne were outnumbered, outclimbed, and outturned. By the time the second wave departed, 188 American aircraft had been destroyed. 29 Japanese aircraft had been lost. The Zero had announced itself. That same morning, on the other side of the international date line, Saburo Sakai's Zero lifted from the runway at Tainan and turned south. 5 hours later, he was over Clark Field outside Manila. He watched B-17s burning on the ground. He watched American P-40 pilots trying to scramble into aircraft that other Zeros were already strafing into pieces. He banked hard into a P-40 climbing toward him at full throttle. 2 short bursts of 20mm cannon fire. The P-40 began to come apart in the air. He flew home through monsoon weather. 1,200 miles. He landed at Tainan with his fuel gauge reading empty. I was sure, Sakai wrote later in his memoirs, that no enemy aircraft could touch us. For 6 months he had every reason to believe it. Between December 1941 and June 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army conquered an area of the Pacific Ocean larger than the continental United States. They sank the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse with land-based torpedo bombers in a single afternoon. They seized Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, the Solomons, much of New Guinea, the Aleutian outposts of Attu and Kiska. They did not lose a major surface engagement. The Zero would emerge from that 6-month campaign with a kill ratio against Allied fighters of approximately 12-1. The Americans died trying. In the cockpits of the Brewster F-2A Buffalo, undersized, underpowered, slower than the Zero in every measurable way, they died. In the cockpits of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, fast in a dive but heavy in a climb, they died. In the cockpits of the Grumman F4F Wildcat, the United States Navy's frontline carrier fighter, they died less often because the Wildcat was tougher than anything the Japanese had expected. It had armor, it had self-sealing fuel tanks, it could absorb hits that no Zero could absorb, but it was slower than the Zero, it could not climb with the Zero. It could not turn with the Zero. Its pilots had not accumulated the combat hours that the Japanese pilots had accumulated over China. They died anyway, just not as fast. In after-action reports filed in Washington in the spring of 1942, American naval aviators wrote sentences that read less like tactical documents and more like testimony. They wrote that you could not turn with a Zero, you could not climb with a Zero, you could not get slow in front of a Zero. The Zero would kill you if you fought it on its own terms. The reports made their way to the United States Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics. They were forwarded to a company in Bethpage, New York, a company that 6 months earlier, 5 months before Pearl Harbor, had signed a contract to design the Wildcat's successor. A company whose engineers were already, in the spring of 1942, bolting together the first prototype of an aircraft they were calling the F6F. They did not yet know it would be called the Hellcat. They did not yet know that the answer to the Zero was already being built. They did not yet know that the answer had been started before the question had even been asked. Bethpage, Long Island, June 30th, 1941. 5 months before the first Japanese aircraft reached Pearl Harbor, a man named Leroy Grumman signs a contract with the United States Navy. He is 46 years old. He flew Curtiss flying boats for the Navy in the First World War. He has soft features and a gentle voice, and the kind of patience you learn from spending years bent over engineering drawings under bad light. The men who work for him at Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation call him by his first name, Roy. Outside the factory, almost nobody knows his face. The contract he signs that morning authorizes Grumman to begin design work on a new fighter aircraft for the United States Navy. The aircraft will be designated XF-6F. It is intended to replace Grumman's previous fighter, the F4F Wildcat, which is already in fleet service. The contract is signed in an office that smells of coffee and ink and the New York summer heat coming off the bay. It is signed 5 months before the Japanese Navy has fired a shot against an American target. It is signed before Pearl Harbor. It is signed before the United States is at war. Leroy Grumman is not designing the Hellcat as a response to the Zero. He is designing it because the Wildcat, however reliable, was already approaching the limit of what its airframe can do. He is designing it because the United States Navy intends, eventually, to need a better fighter than the one it has. He is, without quite knowing it, designing the answer to a question that the Empire of Japan has not yet finished asking. This is the part of the story that most people get wrong. In 1943, when the Hellcat began arriving in the Pacific, Americans who had seen Wildcats die against Zeros looked at the new aircraft and said, "That is the answer to the Zero." They were right about what the Hellcat could do. They were wrong about how it came to exist. The Hellcat was not built in panic. It was not crash-engineered after Pearl Harbor by frightened men working triple shifts. It was the next aircraft in a peacetime design program that had begun before the war and continued through it. That distinction matters, because it tells you something about the country that built it. The United States in the summer of 1941 was a nation that did not yet know it would be at war. But it was a nation whose engineers, working in private companies on Long Island and in Pratt and Whitney factories in Connecticut and at Wright Field outside Dayton, Ohio, were already, quietly, methodically, building the machines that would win a Pacific War they did not know was coming. The Japanese were building a war. The Americans were building a system. The difference would not become visible for 2 years. When it did, it would be decisive. The man who actually drew most of the Hellcat was not Leroy Grumman. It was William Schwendler. Schwendler was 37 years old. He had joined Grumman in 1930, when the company was 11 men working out of a building that had previously been a Cox-Kleemen aircraft factory. By 1941, he was the chief engineer for fighter design. He had drawn the Wildcat, he would draw the Hellcat. After the war, he would draw the F-14 Tomcat. He worked, like Horikoshi in Tokyo, at a drafting table. Like Horikoshi, he received a specification from a navy. Unlike Horikoshi, his specification contained certain assumptions that were so deeply embedded in American engineering culture that they were not even written down. The pilot would survive the aircraft. The aircraft would survive damage that would destroy an enemy aircraft. The aircraft would be built in numbers that no other industrial economy on Earth could match. These were not principles, they were habits of mind. They were what an American aircraft factory in the 1940s did the way an American shipyard built ships and an American steel mill rolled steel. They were not innovations, they were the flaw. Schwendler started with the Wildcat's basic configuration. He scaled it up. He installed the largest engine that Pratt & Whitney could produce in volume, the R2800 Double Wasp, 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower. He added armor behind the pilot's head and along the pilot's back, thick enough to stop most aerial cannon shells at most angles. He added self-sealing fuel tanks lined with raw rubber that swelled shut when punctured. He added a windscreen of laminated glass an inch and a half thick. He added 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns, each with 400 rounds. The combined weight of fire from those 6 guns at convergence range was enough to destroy any Japanese fighter then in existence in a single half-second burst. The aircraft Schwendler drew weighed 9,000 pounds empty, almost twice the weight of a Zero. It was not elegant, it was not graceful. The Zero had been built with the lines of a fish, the Hellcat had the lines of a tractor. It was the ugliest fighter aircraft Grumman ever produced. It would also turn out to be the most lethal. The first XF6F prototype lifted off the runway at Bethpage on June 26, 1942. By that morning, the United States and Japan had been at war for 201 days. The Battle of Midway had concluded 21 days earlier. 4 Japanese carriers had gone to the bottom of the Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost more than 100 experienced naval aviators in less than 4 minutes of dive bomber attacks during the morning of June 4th. It had also, on a different beach, 1,200 miles to the north, lost something else. June 4th, 1942, Akutan Island, in the Aleutian chain of Alaska. A 19-year-old Imperial Japanese Navy pilot named Hiroyoshi Koga is flying a brand new Mitsubishi A6M20, serial number 4, 5 and 3, over Dutch Harbour as part of a diversionary raid timed to coincide with the main attack on Midway. He is hit by ground fire. 3 rounds of 7.62mm machine gun fire enter his engine. One of them seizes the oil return line. Koga does what he has been trained to do. He turns the aircraft away from the American naval base. He flies 25 miles east to a predetermined emergency landing site on Akutan Island, where Imperial Navy submarines are stationed to recover downed pilots. The landing site is a flat, grassy meadow, visible from the air. What Koga cannot see from the air is that the grass conceals a bog. He comes in slow, gear down, attempting a textbook emergency landing on what appears to be solid ground. The wheels of the Zero touch the surface of the grass. The grass collapses under the weight of the aircraft. The wheels dig into wet peat. The aircraft, traveling at roughly 60 miles per hour, pitches forward onto its propeller, flips onto its back, and slides to a stop upside down. Hiroyoshi Koga's neck breaks instantly. He is 19 years old. He had been a fighter pilot for less than a year. His parents in Japan will not receive notification of his death until autumn. His body remains in the cockpit, hanging upside down in the harness for 5 weeks. Wind moves the grass over the wreckage. Rain falls into the open canopy. The aircraft does not burn. The bog is too wet. On July 10, 1942, an American PBY Catalina flying patrol over Akutan spots the silhouette of the Zero, almost intact, lying inverted on the meadow. What the United States Navy found on Akutan Island that afternoon was the most valuable piece of military intelligence the Pacific War would produce. By that point, the Hellcat had been flying as a prototype for 2 weeks. This is the second thing most people get wrong. The Akutan Zero did not design the Hellcat. The Hellcat was already designed, the Hellcat was already flying, the Hellcat was already in production tooling at Bethpage, and it would enter mass production by October. What the Akutan Zero gave the United States was something more valuable than a redesign. It gave the United States the manual. The recovery operation took 6 weeks. The Navy lifted the Zero out of the bog with a crane mounted on a barge, repaired the damaged landing gear, replaced the broken propeller, rebuilt the oil system, and shipped the aircraft to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. There, beginning in September, American test pilots flew the captured Zero against every American fighter in the inventory. What they found was not what they had expected. They had expected to find an aircraft that was simply better than the Wildcat. They found something more specific. They found an aircraft that had been designed for a particular kind of fight, and they found that outside of that fight, it had weaknesses that no Japanese pilot in 2 years of combat had ever fully revealed. Below 200 miles per hour, the Zero was the most agile fighter on Earth. Above 270 miles per hour, its ailerons stiffened so much that pilots could barely move them. Its rate of roll dropped catastrophically. It could not follow a fast-diving aircraft. It could not match a sustained high-speed maneuver. It could not absorb damage. It would burn when shot. The American test pilots wrote all of this down. They wrote it down with engineering precision. They wrote it in tables and charts and acceleration curves. Then they handed the document to Naval Air Operations, and Naval Air Operations did something the Imperial Japanese Navy 4 years earlier had refused to do for its own pilots. It rewrote the manual. Every American fighter pilot deploying to the Pacific from October 1942 onward received a briefing book that had not existed before. The book told them, in plain English, exactly how to fight a Zero. Do not turn with a Zero, do not climb with a Zero, do not engage a Zero at slow speed. Dive on the Zero from above. Fire your 650 calibers in a single pass. Continue your dive past Zero, build airspeed, climb back to altitude using your superior engine power, and dive again. Do not allow the engagement to slow down. The Zero is dangerous, slow, and helpless fast. Keep the fight fast. If you must turn, turn into the Zero. Force a head-on engagement. Your guns will shoot through the Zero. The Zero's guns may not shoot through you. If you're alone, leave. Disengaged in a high-speed dive and rejoin formation. The Zero cannot follow you. Above all, never assume the Japanese pilot is not as good as you. Assume he is better. Then fly the doctrine. The manual was distributed to every Navy fighter squadron in the Pacific. It was taught in the classrooms of naval air stations in Pensacola and Corpus Christi and Jacksonville. It was the gift Tadayoshi Koga had given the United States by dying in the wrong meadow. He was 19, he never knew. While the Akutan Zero was being tested in San Diego, the Pacific War ground forward in the worst combat of the campaign so far. August 7, 1942. The United States 1st Marine Division goes ashore at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The campaign that follows will last 6 months. It will consume a generation of Japanese naval aviators. It will be the meat grinder that Japan cannot afford and the United States can afford only barely. That same morning, Saburo Sakai takes off from Rabaul in his Zero. He is part of an escort group for a flight of Mitsubishi G4M bombers heading south to attack the American beachhead. 600 miles. It is one of the longest combat missions of the war. Over Guadalcanal in the late afternoon, Sakai sees a formation of aircraft he believes are Grumman Wildcats. He climbs to engage. He attacks from below and behind. Textbook approach. The aircraft are not Wildcats. They are Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, 2-seat, with rear gunners. The rear gunners open fire on Sakai at close range with their 50 caliber Browning machine guns, the same 50 calibers that will arm the Hellcat. Bullets enter Sakai's canopy. One round passes through his goggles and across his forehead, another tears through the side of his skull above the right ear. He goes blind in his right eye. The left side of his body becomes paralyzed. His Zero, with him barely conscious in the cockpit, begins a slow descent toward the sea. He wakes seconds before impact, fights the controls with his one good hand, and pulls the aircraft level. He flies 600 miles north to Rabaul, half blind, in and out of consciousness, hemorrhaging from his head wound, navigating by the position of the sun. He lands at Rabaul nearly 5 hours after being hit. The mechanics who pull him out of the cockpit say later that the floor of the Zero was wet with his blood up to their ankles. He survives. He lives. He never sees out of his right eye again. He will not fly combat in a Zero against a Hellcat for the duration of the war. But the Pacific is full of pilots like him. The Pacific in 1942 is consuming the men Japan trained for 10 years and cannot replace. Each one of them is a permanent loss. The Hellcat finished its acceptance trials in January 1943. The first production aircraft rolled off the Bethpage assembly line in February. By July, Grumman was producing Hellcats at a rate of 250 per month. In August, the first Hellcat squadrons embarked aboard the new American fleet carriers Essex and Yorktown and Independence. The aircraft carrier Yorktown, hull number CV-10, is not the Yorktown that was sunk at Midway. That ship, CV-5, lies on the bottom of the Pacific. CV-10 is its replacement. The United States has named the new ship after the dead one in the way a family names a son after a father who has been killed. By August 31, 1943, CV-10 is steaming north of Marcus Island, 1,200 miles southeast of Tokyo. On the morning of September 1st, the aircraft of Fighting Squadron 5 take off from her flight deck. Fighting Squadron 5, VF-5, the first squadron in the United States Navy to take the Hellcat into combat. They are flying a fighter sweep over Marcus, a small Japanese-held island that the Navy has decided to use as a live-fire training range for the new aircraft. The Japanese garrison scrambles its handful of available fighters. What happens next is not a battle, it is a demonstration. The Hellcats of VF-5 destroy nearly every Japanese aircraft over Marcus. They take no losses to enemy fighters. The pilots of VF-5 land back aboard Yorktown that afternoon and report to their commanding officer that the Hellcat does in fact work. The commanding officer transmits the report to Pacific Fleet Headquarters at Pearl Harbor. Pacific Fleet Headquarters transmits it to Washington. Washington opens the production tap. In 1943, Grumman built 2,545 Hellcats. In 1944, it would build 6,139. Mitsubishi, during the same 2 years, built a combined total of fewer than 7,000 Zeros. The math had become arithmetic. The arithmetic was unanswerable. But the math, however merciless, was not the deepest part of the story. The deepest part was the men. The United States Navy entered 1943 with roughly 16,000 combat-trained naval aviators. By the end of 1944, it had trained tens of thousands more. They went through a pipeline that processed candidates through primary training at Pensacola, intermediate training at Corpus Christi, advanced training in the Hellcats and Corsairs and Avengers at carrier qualification fields in Florida and the Great Lakes. The pipeline was industrial. It was relentless. It was a production line for aviators the way Grumman was a production line for aircraft. Japan had no equivalent. The Imperial Naval Air Service had begun the war with approximately 3,500 fully qualified combat aviators. By the autumn of 1944, after Coral Sea and Midway and Guadalcanal and Rabaul and the Bismarck Sea and the slow grinding attrition of the Solomons campaign, the Imperial Naval Air Service had a fraction of that number remaining. The training pipeline that had produced Saburo Sakai, with 65 of 70 candidates eliminated before graduation, had not changed. It still required 2 years. It still required hundreds of flight hours before a pilot could be considered ready for combat. It still produced, when it produced anything at all, aviators of extraordinary quality. There was simply not enough time to produce them. In the cockpits of the Zeros that flew out of Rabaul and Saipan and Yap in 1943 and 1944 were not the men who had flown to Pearl Harbor. Those men were dead, or recovering from wounds, or trapped in remote island airfields with no fuel and no aircraft. The men who replaced them had a fraction of the training. They had a fraction of the flight hours. They had been rushed through what remained of the pipeline because there was nothing else to send. They climbed into the same aircraft. They wore the same uniforms. They flew under the same flag. They were not the same pilots. The Americans noticed it before the Japanese did. By the spring of 1944, American naval aviators were filing after action reports that no longer read like the reports of 1942. The earlier reports had described the Zero with respect and the Japanese pilot with fear. The new reports described the Zero as a known quantity, and the Japanese pilot often as inexperienced. The new reports also described something else. They described American pilots in Hellcats pressing engagements that, 2 years earlier, American pilots in Wildcats would have broken off. They described American pilots flying outnumbered and coming back claiming kills. They described tactics that assumed the American aircraft would be faster, tougher, and better armed than its opponent, and that the American pilot would be fighting from a position of advantage. The American pilots had stopped being afraid. Japanese pilots, filing their own reports back to Tokyo, used a word for what they were seeing. In translation, it appears in Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service records preserved after the war. The word, in the careful military Japanese of the period, conveys something specific. It is not the word for terror, it is not the word for awe, it is the word for the absence of fear in an opponent who used to have it. The Japanese pilots wrote it down because they could not understand it. They could not understand how an enemy that had been hesitant in 1942 had become, in 18 months, an enemy that came directly at them, that accepted head-on engagements, that returned for second and third passes when by every prior measure of the Pacific Air War the sensible move would have been to disengage of it. They wrote down what they were seeing. They did not yet have the vocabulary for what it meant. The reckoning came on the 19th and 20th of June 1944, west of the Mariana Islands. The Imperial Japanese Navy, in a final attempt to halt the American advance toward the Philippines and the Japanese home islands, committed 9 aircraft carriers and more than 400 carrier-based aircraft to a single coordinated attack against Task Force 58 of the United States Pacific Fleet. It was the largest carrier battle in history. Task Force 58 had 15 carriers. It had 900 aircraft. More than 400 of those aircraft were Hellcats. It also had something the Imperial Japanese Navy did not have. It had radar. It had ship-to-ship voice radio. It had a coordinated fighter direction network that could track inbound Japanese strikes from 150 miles away and vector Hellcats into intercepting positions with seconds of precision. The Japanese attack arrived in 4 waves over the course of June 19th. The Hellcats met them in the air. By the end of the second day, more than 300 Japanese carrier aircraft had been destroyed. 2 Japanese carriers had been sunk by American submarines. A third would be sunk the following day by Hellcat-led airstrikes. The United States lost 123 aircraft, most of them in the chaotic night landings of June 20th, when American strike groups returned to their carriers in total darkness, low on fuel, and Admiral Mark Mitchell ordered the entire task force to turn on its lights. The lights came on across the Pacific that night. The American pilots came home. Most of the Japanese pilots who died in those 2 days had been in flight school 6 months earlier. The American pilots who killed them included a 34-year-old former Naval Academy diving champion named David McCampbell, commanding officer of Air Group 15 aboard the USS Essex, who would survive the Marianas and 4 months later at Leyte Gulf become the only American pilot in history to shoot down 9 enemy aircraft in a single mission. They included a 25-year-old from East Chicago, Indiana, named Alex Vrasiu, who on the afternoon of June 19th destroyed 6 Japanese dive bombers in 8 minutes with a total expenditure of 360 rounds of ammunition. 60 rounds per kill. Vrasiu landed back aboard the Lexington that evening, climbed out of his Hellcat, and held up 6 fingers to the deck crew. The deck crew cheered. In the briefing room afterward, Vrasiu wrote a report that took up a single page. The American pilots who flew through those 2 days west of the Marianas did not yet know what to call the battle. They knew it had been one-sided. They knew it had been historic. They knew, looking at the empty sky as the second day ended, that something fundamental had broken in the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service and was not going to be put back together. In the wardroom that evening, a pilot whose name has been lost to history described what he had seen during the afternoon's combat in a single phrase. He said, "It was like a turkey shoot up there. The phrase entered the report entered the records. History remembered it. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was over." The men who would fly the rest of the war for Japan were already, in many cases, sitting in classrooms in southern Honshu, awaiting orders they would not survive. The Hellcat had not won the war, but it had ended the question of who was going to. October 26, 1944. A Mitsubishi L2D transport aircraft, the Imperial Japanese Navy's licensed copy of the American DC-3, is flying west across the central Philippines, climbing slowly to clear the mountainous spine of Mindoro. In the passenger compartment, strapped into a metal jump seat with a parachute on his back and nothing in his hands, sits a 24-year-old man named Hiroyoshi Nishizawa. By any honest measure, he is the best surviving fighter pilot in the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service. He was born in 1920 in Nagano Prefecture, the son of a textile worker. He failed his first attempt at the Navy pilot examination. He passed his second. He arrived at the Tainan Air Group in the autumn of 1941, the same season as Saburo Sakai, and with the quiet self-possession of a young man who suspects he has finally found something he is going to be good at. He was. By his own count, in 2 years of combat over the South Pacific, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa shot down more than 80 Allied aircraft. The confirmed number is lower. Aerial victory claims in any air force are imperfect, but even at the most conservative estimates, Nishizawa is among the top 3 or 4 fighter pilots Japan ever produced. He is tall and thin, almost gaunt, with the kind of unsmiling face that men who fight for a living sometimes develop. His fellow pilots call him Devil. His commanding officers call him irreplaceable. He is, on the morning of October 26th, irreplaceable. He is also a passenger. Because the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service no longer has a Zero for him to fly. His unit has just been ordered to participate in the first organized kamikaze attacks against the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. Nishizawa, who had argued against this kind of war and lost that argument, has been sent ahead by transport to a Philippine airfield where new Zeros are reportedly waiting. He does not believe new Zeros are waiting. The Imperial Naval Air Service has been telling its pilots for months that new Zeros are waiting. There are no new Zeros. There have been no new Zeros for a long time. The aircraft factories in Nagoya are being bombed. The fuel reserves are nearly exhausted. The pilots Nishizawa would train, if the system could still train pilots, are being sent directly into kamikaze cockpits with no training at all. But the orders are the orders. He boards the transport in central Luzon at first light. He sits down, he buckles in, he closes his eyes. Somewhere over the coast of Mindoro, 2 Grumman F6F Hellcats from Fighting Squadron 14 aboard the USS Wasp catch the transport in clear sky at 3,000 feet. The Hellcats roll into firing position. The pilot of the L2D does what he can. There is not much he can do. A twin-engine transport against 2 carrier fighters has in this particular war, in this particular year, no meaningful chance. The Hellcats fire. The L2D catches fire in its starboard engine. It falls. There are no survivors. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, the highest-scoring surviving fighter pilot of the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service, dies in the passenger compartment of a transport aircraft on the way to pick up a Zero he was never going to receive. He is 24 years old. The Hellcat pilots who shot him down did not know his name. They would not have known they had just killed the man whose face had appeared on Japanese recruiting posters, who had been mentioned in dispatches in Tokyo, who had been pictured 18 months earlier in a propaganda film standing in dress uniform on the deck of a carrier. They returned to the Wasp, they debriefed, they ate dinner, they went to sleep. The next morning they flew again. By the time the Pacific War ended 10 months later, the Grumman F6F Hellcat had been credited with the destruction of 5,163 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. That figure represents approximately 56% of all aerial victories scored by the United States Navy during the Second World War. The combat loss ratio for the Hellcat across the entirety of its service was approximately 19:1. For every Hellcat lost in air combat, 19 Japanese aircraft went down. There has never been another aircraft in the history of military aviation that achieved a comparable record at comparable scale. Total Hellcat production by Grumman from 1942 to 1945, 12,275 aircraft. Total Mitsubishi Zero production across the same period, 10,939 aircraft. The numbers are close. The outcomes were not. The difference was not in the airframes alone. It was in the engineering philosophies that had built the airframes. It was in the training pipelines that had produced their pilots. It was in the industrial capacities of the two nations that had committed to the war. It was in the answer to a question that the Imperial Japanese Navy had never honestly asked itself. Was a pilot worth more than range? The United States Navy had answered yes. The Imperial Japanese Navy had answered no. That answer cost Japan the war in the air. After the surrender, American historians, working with translators and Japanese naval officers willing to cooperate, began the slow process of reconstructing what the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service had actually believed about its enemy. They found, in the after-action reports filed by Japanese pilots from late 1943 onward, a remarkable consistency of language. Different pilots in different squadrons in different theatres, writing reports that would not be collected for translation for another 20 years, described the same observation in nearly identical terms. The Americans, they wrote, fought as though they knew how the fight would end. The Americans were no longer afraid. The Americans came back for a second pass. The Americans absorbed punishment that should have been fatal. The Americans flew aircraft that did not burn. Some of the reports went further. Some of them named the aircraft specifically. F6F Hellcat. The reports could be read in chronological sequence as a slow dawning recognition of a truth the Imperial Japanese Navy had been refusing to accept since 1941. The pilots could not be replaced. The aircraft that did not protect them could. This was the wrong way around. Among the Japanese officers who survived the war was a man named Minoru Genda. He was the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was the staff officer aboard the carrier Akagi, who, in the spring of 1941, had worked out the operational plan for striking the United States Pacific Fleet at its anchorage. He had selected the aircraft. He had timed the waves. He had built the calculations that turned the morning of December 7th into one of the most successful surprise attacks in modern military history. He had also been a fighter pilot himself in the 1930s. He understood aircraft. He understood the men who flew them. After the war, Genda was retained by the United States occupation authorities as a consultant. He helped rebuild what would eventually become the Japan Air Self-Defense Force. He served in the Japanese Diet for 24 years. He also wrote, in his post-war military writings, Genda assessed the air war in the Pacific with the calm, professional honesty of a man who had nothing left to lose and no audience to please. The conclusion he reached, expressed across multiple post-war essays and interviews, was that the F6F Hellcat had been the correct answer to the Zero. It had solved the problem the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service had created for itself by prioritizing range and maneuverability over pilot survival and aircraft durability. And if the United States had produced the Hellcat in 1942 instead of 1943, the Pacific War would have unfolded in ways, Genda suggested, that were difficult to contemplate even from the distance of post-war decades. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor wrote that the men who had built the Hellcat at Bethpage had identified, with engineering precision, the fatal weakness in the philosophy of his own navy. He did not write this in bitterness, he wrote it in respect. Saburo Sakai survived the war. He flew his last combat mission on August 18, 1945, 3 days after the formal Japanese surrender announcement. He attacked a B-32 reconnaissance bomber over Tokyo Bay. He did not shoot it down. He did not believe the war was actually over. By the time he understood that it was, he had been flying combat for almost 10 years. In 1957, 12 years after the war ended, Sakai sat down with the American journalist Martin Kaiden and the Japanese writer Fred Saito and dictated his memoirs. The book was called Samurai. It was and remains one of the most honest accounts of Japanese naval aviation ever written. Sakai did not flatter himself. He did not flatter his country. He did not flatter the men he had fought against. He simply told what he had seen. What he had seen included the morning over Guadalcanal when he had been blinded by an American rear gunner whose name he never learned. It included the long flight north to Rabaul with his blood pooling on the cockpit floor. It included the slow recognition in his squadron and across the Imperial Naval Air Service that the war they had begun with such confidence in 1941 was being lost, aircraft by aircraft, pilot by pilot, year by year, to a country that had built a system rather than a navy. Sakai never wrote the sentence below in those exact words, but it is the recognition that runs underneath every page of his memoir, and it is the conclusion that Japanese pilots had been reaching independently for years. The United States had built airplanes that brought their pilots home. Japan had built airplanes that did not. Sakai lived another 43 years after the war. He spent much of his later life as a Buddhist. He met at conferences and reunions several of the American pilots he had fought against and a few of the ones whose squadrons had nearly killed him. He shook their hands. He drank with them. He spoke at memorial services for men who had died on both sides. He died in the year 2000 at the age of 84, surrounded by his family. In the end, what every Japanese pilot had said about American naval fighters was not, as some accounts have suggested, a single phrase. It was a single recognition. The Americans had built their aircraft around the men who flew them. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its aircraft around the missions the men were sent to fly. One philosophy assumed the pilots could be replaced. The other refused to. The philosophy that refused to won. The pilots who survived the war, on both sides, spent the rest of their lives understanding that. The men at Bethpage, who had drawn the Hellcat in the summer of 1941, before the question of the Zero had even been fully asked, had built an aircraft that did not merely match the Zero, or defeat the Zero, or out-engineer the Zero. They had built an aircraft that brought its pilots home. That was the answer. That was what every Japanese pilot in the end had said. That was what they had recognized. That was what, after 1943, they could no longer defeat. The Pacific Ocean fell quiet in the autumn of 1945. Above it, where Hellcats and Zeros had once fought, the sky returned to the way it had been before the war began. The men who had flown those aircraft went home. Some of them did. The others were already there.